In the Soviet Union, between 1937 and 1938, that was the sound millions of people dreaded. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a late-night visitor. It was the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. And that knock, usually in the dead of night, meant one of two things: a swift execution in a damp cellar, or a one-way trip to the brutal labor camps of the Gulag. This is the story of how one man's paranoia plunged a nation into an abyss of terror, shattering the lives of millions. It was a time when a careless word, a jealous neighbor, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time could lead to that fateful knock, the knock that meant death. So, how did it come to this? To understand the terror, you have to go back to the death of one man, Vladimir Lenin. When the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution died in 1924, a power vacuum opened up at the very top of the Soviet Union. Out of that struggle, one man emerged. He didn't win through charisma or brilliant speeches, but through cunning, patience, and ruthless ambition. His name was Joseph Jugashvili, better known as Joseph Stalin. Stalin, the man of steel, spent the late 1920s methodically taking control. He outmaneuvered his rivals one by one. The fiery intellectual Leon Trotsky was exiled, and other prominent old Bolsheviks like Nikolai Bukharin and Grigory Zinoviev were pushed to the sidelines. By 1929, Stalin was the undisputed dictator of the Soviet Union. But absolute power didn't make him feel safe. The Bolsheviks were haunted by the ghosts of past revolutions. They looked at the French Revolution of 1789 and saw how it devoured its own children before falling apart. They were obsessed with the idea of a fifth column, a secret army of internal enemies just waiting for the right moment to strike and bring back capitalism. This fear was baked into their ideology. Stalin and his inner circle were convinced that to protect their new world, they had to be more ruthless than anyone before them. They would not repeat the mistakes of history. This paranoia was only made worse by the chaos of Stalin's own policies. His forced collectivization of agriculture had caused a massive famine and the deaths of millions. His ambitious 5-year plans for industrialization set impossible goals, leading to breakdowns, accidents, and dissent. But in Stalin's mind, these weren't policy failures. They were proof of a conspiracy. He saw wreckers and saboteurs everywhere, deliberately undermining the Soviet state from within. The stage was set for a tragedy. All it needed was a spark. That spark came on December 1st, 1934. Inside the Smolny Institute, the Communist Party headquarters in Leningrad, a single gunshot echoed. Sergei Kirov, the head of the Leningrad Party, charismatic, popular, was dead. He was assassinated by a disgruntled young party member named Leonid Nikolaev. Kirov was a rising star. He was a loyal Stalinist, but his popularity was seen by some as a potential threat to Stalin's absolute rule. At the 1934 Party Congress, Kirov had supposedly received far fewer negative votes than Stalin, a clear sign of his influence. Whether Stalin truly saw him as a rival is still debated. But what's certain is how he used Kirov's death. Instead of a simple murder investigation, Stalin declared it the work of a vast, sinister plot. It was the first shot, he claimed, in a war waged by traitors hidden inside the Communist Party itself. This was the excuse he needed. Within hours, Stalin personally drafted the Law of December 1st. This law stripped accused terrorists of the right to appeal or even a proper defense, basically giving the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, a blank check to dispense justice as they saw fit. Stalin himself interrogated the assassin. Soon, a massive conspiracy was uncovered. The plot was said to involve his old rivals, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. Even though they had nothing to do with the crime, they were charged with moral responsibility and sent to prison. This was just the beginning. The murder of one man was about to become the justification for murdering hundreds of thousands. With the ghost of Kirov's murder hanging over the country, Stalin launched the next phase, a series of elaborate public spectacles of justice known as the Moscow Show Trials. These weren't trials. They were theater, carefully scripted productions meant to prove the existence of the grand conspiracy Stalin had invented. The first major show trial began on August 19, 1936. 16 defendants, including the famous old Bolsheviks Zinoviev and Kamenev, were accused of forming a Trotskyite Zinovievite terrorist center. The prosecutor, Andrei Vyshinsky, known for his venomous speeches, accused them of murdering Kirov and plotting to assassinate Stalin, all on the orders of the exiled Leon Trotsky. There was no evidence. The entire case rested on confessions. And confess they did. One by one, these hardened revolutionaries, men who had faced Tsarist police, stood up and admitted to the most absurd crimes. They called themselves traitors and murderers. The world was baffled. How? The answer was in the cellars of the Lubyanka, the infamous NKVD prison. The defendants had been tortured, deprived of sleep, and psychologically broken. They were promised their lives, or the lives of their families, if they played their part. It was a deal with the devil. After they confessed publicly, all 16 were found guilty and sentenced to death. Stalin broke his promise. They were executed almost immediately. This set the pattern. A second trial in January 1937 targeted other leaders for sabotage and espionage. One defendant confessed to flying to Oslo to get instructions from Trotsky, a flight that aviation records later proved never happened. The final, largest show trial in March 1938 featured Nikolai Bukharin, once called the Golden Boy of the Revolution. He was accused of everything from plotting to kill Lenin in 1918 to murdering the writer Maxim Gorky. Even the former head of the NKVD, Genrikh Yagoda, who organized the first trial, now found himself in the dock. The purge was starting to eat its own. These trials created a narrative of an enemy that was everywhere, sowing fear and suspicion. But as horrifying as they were just the tip of the iceberg. While the world watched the drama in Moscow, a far more vast and indiscriminate terror was being unleashed on the ordinary people of the Soviet Union. The show trials eliminated the old guard, but Stalin's paranoia ran deeper. He believed the country was crawling with millions of anti-Soviet elements. To deal with them, on July 30th, 1937, the new head of the NKVD, a ruthless man named Nikolai Yezhov, signed one of the deadliest documents in history, NKVD Order No. 0447. This secret order was chillingly bureaucratic. It commanded a massive operation to repress former kulaks, criminals, and other anti-Soviet elements. It set regional quotas for arrests and, most terrifyingly, for executions. The order split enemies into two groups. Category 1, to be arrested and shot. Category 2, to be arrested and sent to the Gulag for 8 to 10 years. Suddenly, the terror burst its banks and flooded every corner of Soviet life. The knock on the door became a universal nightmare. Who were these anti-Soviet elements? The definition was so broad it was meaningless. It could be a peasant once labeled a kulak, a priest, someone with a relative abroad, a person who told a political joke, or simply someone denounced by a jealous neighbor who wanted their apartment. NKVD units worked tirelessly to meet and exceed their quotas. In Omsk, the local NKVD chief, having already hit his execution target, requested a higher limit for thousands more. The terror fed on itself. People informed on friends and family to save their own skin. The trust that holds a society together crumbled. The process was brutally simple. The NKVD would arrive at night. An arrest would be made. The victim was taken to prison and interrogated. Torture was systematic. Prisoners were beaten and deprived of sleep until they signed a confession to whatever crimes their interrogators invented. These cases were then sent to an NKVD troika, a three-person panel that rubber-stamped hundreds of sentences a day, often in just a few minutes. There was no defense, no appeal. For those in Category 1, the end came with a pistol shot to the back of the head. Just from this single order, the NKVD executed some 387,000 Soviet citizens. But this was only one part of the wider terror. In 1937 and 1938, the total number of executions for political crimes was a staggering 681,692, based on the NKVD's own records. This was the heart of the Great Terror, a state-organized machine of mass murder. Why? Why would a leader do this to his own nation? To understand the Great Purge, we have to look into the dark, twisted mind of Joseph Stalin. His actions weren't just cold calculation. They were the product of a deeply paranoid and disturbed man. Many historians argue that Stalin showed classic traits of narcissism, sadism, and extreme paranoia. He was consumed by suspicion and a desire for revenge. This was likely forged in a brutal childhood. Growing up in Georgia, he had a cruel, abusive father, an experience that may have bred in him a hatred of any authority but his own. He was also deeply insecure. Among the intellectual giants of the Bolshevik Party, he was the undereducated outsider. He seemed pathologically driven to destroy anyone who had seen his earlier, weaker self. This helps explain why his first targets were the old Bolsheviks. They knew the real Stalin, the unpolished Koba, and for that, they had to be erased. His cruelty was personal. When his son Yakov tried to commit suicide, Stalin's reported response was a sneer. He can't even shoot straight. This cold detachment allowed him to see human lives as mere statistics, pawns in his paranoid game. The Great Terror wasn't inevitable. The most intense phase, the mass operations of 1937 to 38, ended only when Stalin himself decided to halt it. But the system of repression he created lasted until his death in 1953. The terror was a projection of his own mind. He saw enemies everywhere because his personality required them. He fused his own security with the security of the state. Any challenge to his authority, real or imagined, was treason against the Soviet Union itself. This fusion of personal paranoia and absolute power created the perfect storm. The Great Purge, or Yezhovshchina, as it was called after NKVD head Yezhov, was a cataclysm that spared no one. The victims were mostly ordinary citizens, workers, peasants, teachers, engineers, artists, all swept up in the dragnet. The military was a special target. Stalin was deeply suspicious of the Red Army's leadership, which was founded by his hated rival Trotsky. He unleashed a devastating purge of its officer corps. In just 2 years, 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, 13 of 15 army commanders, and 8 of 9 admirals were removed. While initial estimates were higher, recent research shows that approximately 35,000 officers were arrested or dismissed, with several thousand of them being executed, though over 11,000 were later reinstated. This decapitation of the military had catastrophic consequences. When Nazi Germany invaded in 1941, the Red Army was crippled, its most experienced commanders dead or in the Gulag. The terror also became ethnic. Stalin was suspicious of national minorities, seeing them as potential collaborators with foreign powers. The NKVD launched a series of national operations targeting specific ethnic groups. The Polish operation was one of the most brutal. Over 111,000 Soviet citizens of Polish descent were executed based on fabricated charges of espionage. Germans, Latvians, Koreans, and many others were also targeted for mass repression. The intelligentsia, writers, artists, scientists, were systematically persecuted. A climate of fear crushed creativity. Even astronomy wasn't safe. Scientists could be shot for having an ideologically incorrect view of sunspots. The goal was to break the people's spirit and eliminate independent thought. The numbers are hard to grasp. During the peak years of 1937 and 1938, official archives show at least 681,692 people were executed. More than 1 million others were sent to labor camps. The total death toll of Stalin's entire rule, including famines, executions, and the Gulag, is hotly debated. Older estimates sometimes reached as high as 20 million. But modern historians, using archival data, often suggest a figure of 6 to 9 million direct or foreseeable deaths, while acknowledging that indirect deaths from famine and repression make the total number of victims much higher. For those who got the knock and were classified as Category 2, the sentence was a slow, agonizing death. They were destined for the Gulag, the vast archipelago of forced labor camps stretching across the most inhospitable parts of the Soviet Union. The journey itself was an ordeal. Prisoners were herded into overcrowded cattle cars for weeks, with little food or water. Many died before they even arrived. Those who survived found themselves in a frozen hell. They were forced into grueling labor, logging in sub-zero temperatures, mining for gold, or building canals with primitive tools, all while working 12 to 14-hour days on starvation rations. The conditions were designed to break the human spirit. Disease, exhaustion, and starvation were rampant. For many, a sentence to the Gulag was just a deferred death sentence. Survivors recalled seeing fellow inmates descend into madness, howling like animals or digging through garbage for scraps. The Gulag was a key part of Stalin's terror. It not only removed undesirables, but also provided a massive workforce for his industrialization projects, built on the bones of slave labor. Millions were trapped in this system. Many wouldn't see freedom until after Stalin's death in 1953. The Gulag became a byword for totalitarian cruelty, a symbol of a state-run system of slavery and death that remains one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. By the end of 1938, the frenzy of the Great Terror began to subside. The machine had become too chaotic, even for Stalin. He turned on its architect, Nikolai Yezhov, who was arrested, tortured, and executed. The purger purged. Stalin cynically blamed the excesses on Yezhov, painting himself as the one who had restored order. But the damage was done. The Great Purge left Soviet society deeply traumatized and transformed. Stalin had successfully obliterated all political opposition. The Communist Party was no longer a body of revolutionaries. It was a collection of terrified sycophants who rubber-stamped his every whim. This was the birth of the cult of personality, a system of one-man rule built on absolute fear. The terror had atomized the population, shattering trust between colleagues, neighbors, and even families, creating a psychic wound that would last for generations. Years later, in a secret speech in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev finally condemned the purges as a monstrous abuse of power, admitting that countless innocent people had been victims. The story of Stalin's terror is a chilling reminder of how a society can be turned against itself, driven by the paranoia of a single leader. It all comes back to that simple, terrifying sound in the middle of the night. The knock on the door. A sound that, for millions of innocent people, meant the end of their world. And a sound that serves as a timeless warning about the terrifying consequences of absolute power. If you found this exploration of one of history's darkest chapters valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the past. Let us know in the comments what historical events you'd like to see us cover next. And if you'd like to support our work directly, you can do so through the Patreon link in the description below. Thank you for watching.